How's it going, folks? So, I want to discuss this whole middle ground aspect of the debate on the right to keep and bear arms versus gun control. So, yes, this monologue on this issue might go on for a little bit, but I do want to explain things and spell things out. You'll notice also that I will be using props in this video to discuss specific types of firearms that I'm talking about. So, honestly, if somebody cannot bear to see the sight of a firearm on their computer screen, I don't know what to tell you. Unfortunately, there have been people who have complained about me using firearms as props in the past, and I don't see why this is a issue because the topic that's being discussed are firearms and the laws governing firearms. So, now, on this whole topic in and of itself, you will find people saying, why isn't there any middle ground to the right to keep and bear arms versus gun control topic? Well, the fact of the matter is, and I'm saying the conclusion straightforward, is that at the end of the day, there is really no middle ground to be had, and I will explain it really in this video. At times, I will say one can say that this is it. However, this is honestly for entertaining entertainment purposes, as in you're entertaining the idea, you're not having to accept the idea. So let's start off with the pure version of the RKBA side and the purest version of the gun control side. With the RKBA, the purest side, generally speaking, would be okay and generally pushes for the right for private individuals to own and carry firearms unimpeded by government barriers, unrestricted by government barriers, and really massive corporations, banks, things of that nature, from imposing their own artificial restrictions as well. When it comes to the gun control side, they wish to have private disarmament. Nobody has any firearms, no weapons, period. End of story. And that's the gun control purist side. One would say, with the right to keep and bear arms side, that, hey, you're not being imposed on. Nobody is forcing you to own a firearm. I mean, while there have been people in the U.S. that have floated the idea of incentives to own and carry a firearm, such as tax breaks, things of that nature, no real actual discussion on that topic is being had. Nobody's making a serious push for it, and it's unlikely that any such thing would arise. Now, with the gun control side, at least in the U.S., they do end up saying, well, we want the government and the taxpayers to be forced to subsidize our side. But let me reel it back to the right to keep and bear arms side. With our side, you could say the middle ground is right there. Hey, government stays out of it, corporations stay out of it, and each and every person choose to own and carry their firearm or not. They can choose to carry whatever weapon just about that they have the means to own and carry, or they can choose to not do this, or somewhere in between. With the gun controllers, nobody has that option because it's dependent that you not have your firearm. They want to make it both illegal and physically impossible for you to do so. So there you have it on that one. So one could say the right to keep and bear arms side is the middle ground. So with this being said, let's move to the Second Amendment in the U.S. I'm going to cover this. We have a constitutionally protected right to keep and bear arms, even though the gun controllers may sit there and say, well, no, it's not really the case. However, when you look at how the Second Amendment side, the right to keep and bear arms side, explains the Second Amendment, well, it certainly makes a lot more sense than how the gun controllers try to explain it. So you have the Second Amendment side, the right to keep and bear arms side, say a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security uh, of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. They'll say, okay, yeah, when you go to well-regulated militia, which is oftentimes what the gun controllers love to sit there and pretend the right to keep and bear arms side ignores. And this is one of the ways you can tell they're not being genuine when they say this, because all you have to do is talk to some of us on the right to keep and bear arms side, and we'll fully explain it. And the way we explain it actually makes sense together. The first part reinforces the second part. With the gun controllers, they're all over the place. Some of them just want to use the term well regulated in a vacuum and pretend none of the other words exists. Some of them want to sit there and say, well, well regulated means a bunch of restrictions, and that the militia is the National Guard. But then, even with that reading, it would read that the National Guard is supposed to be highly restricted, and the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. You know, almost, if you read it that way, it's almost as if the people are supposed to be armed to be able to keep the National Guard restricted. But again, when you try to explain this to a gun controller, they're dumbfounded. It's like it went over their head that they just, with their particular reading like that, they've ended up just counteracting their whole point. Furthermore, some of them just want to, again, use well regulated in a vacuum and pretend like well regulated meant a lot of regulations. And I know I've covered this before, and then ignore the rest. I've even had one or two gun controllers tell me that the people were really the institution, the aristocrats, which, or the government itself, which would mean that many other of our constitutionally protected amendments would also be meaningless at that point. You have parts of the First Amendment that would be meaningless. They mention the people in the First Amendment. In the Fourth Amendment, they mention the people. So I guess, in all honesty, if you want to argue that way, I mean, you would also argue that the police can come in and search your home at any time they want. That the Fourth Amendment is meaningless because the Fourth Amendment mentions the people. So you see where the gun controllers fail on this. Furthermore, if you take the entire history of the U.S., from war for from just prior to the War for Independence all the way up to 1791, when the Bill of Rights was ratified, and you go through that history lines up with the right to keep and bear arms side. And the gun controllers, again, are stuck doing mental gymnastics and just picking portions out of the history between just prior to our war for independence and just after the ratification of our Bill of Rights. They will pick something like Shays' Rebellion and put that in a vacuum. And say, well, you see, because of Shays' Rebellion, they really didn't mean it for to be the people. Now, the pro right to keep and bear arms side can easily explain this. Well, no, the people needed to have the weapons to defend themselves from Shay and his men. So you see, the right to keep and bear arms side has a simple, straightforward, logical explanation. With the gun control side, again, you have to do mental gymnastics before you can get to their conclusion. You have to cherry pick. You have to use a very large number of logical fallacies in order to get to them having any sort of credence whatsoever. And I'm going to shut this off. I don't really care to start over again. So, where do you get middle ground from that? I mean, which we can move forward to today's state of affairs in the U.S. Well, the fact of the matter is we have a ton of unconstitutional gun laws on the books. And really, on the federal level, the very first gun laws we had in this country came well after, nearly a century and a half after the Bill of Rights was ratified. That's when you got the first federal gun control laws on the books. That should be really telling. Now, various states after Reconstruction and during Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, enacted a number of gun laws. Now, at first, they were explicitly targeting free slaves, and then after several court rulings said you couldn't do that, well, they ended up making them universal, to pretend as if they were not actually targeting the freed slaves. However, even those were selectively enforced. And then later on became universally enforced as the culture shifted. Now, unfortunately, many of those laws did not get the challenge in court that they needed. And furthermore, not many people put their foot down about the right to keep and bear arms there, which is unfortunate. But then, now we have the NFA, which, again, gun controllers love to cite the Miller case, which, again, there's a number of problems with the Miller case, and in particular, the way the gun controllers tell it. First off, with the Miller case, Miller had passed away before it got to the Supreme Court. Then, so you didn't have any defense arguing against the prosecution, but then you also didn't have the prosecution arguing that gun control was constitutional. What they argued the NFA was just a tax on interstate commerce, that it wasn't actually dealing with the right to keep and bear arms. Furthermore, at that point, FDR had already been stacking the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court, with a number of his other policies, had been striking them down as unconstitutional, as they were. For those of you who don't know, I think FDR was a horrible president. If you can even call him that, he was a stain on this country. The man was power hungry. He was the one that broke the two-term tradition, which later led to a constitutional amendment making that two-term tradition that George Washington had set to be a constitutional requirement now at that point. Now, I know I got off topic here. So, needless to say, the NFA was not upheld as being gun control or civilian disarmament or an infringement on the right to keep and bear arms. It was falsely held up as a tax on interstate commerce. The long and short of it. And furthermore, if you get into the details of the Miller case, you will find that, and that one of the things the prosecution did argue was that, well, that shotgun really wasn't a military weapon, therefore, you know, not really an arm. So, ironically, look what the gun controllers are arguing today. It's weapons of war. And the other problem with that is that short barrel shotguns were actually used as weapons of war prior to that. See World War One and U.S. Quote war crimes as per the Kaiser of Germany. Yeah, the German Kaiser claimed that the use of U.S. soldiers with shotguns was a war crime. Imagine that. So, one could argue that if there was any real middle ground to violating the Second Amendment, to the Second Amendment and what the gun control side wanted, one could say, yeah, that NFA would have been that. But they didn't stop there, did they? At the federal level, 1968, they passed another major gun control act called the Gun Control Act of 1968. This is where you get your prohibited class. So again, that didn't really get as much challenge as it should have, and this is a point where a number of people decided it was time to start pushing back because, well, we started to see, that okay. Now there was pushback to the previous laws, but this is where groups like the NRA started to say, okay, you're going a little bit too far. And this is where you started getting groups like Gun Owners of America come up, you know. So, with this being said, one could say that that was the middle ground at that point, and that they shouldn't go on even further. But yet, the gun controllers still were not satisfied, were they? I mean, anyone want to object to that? So, from that point, the middle ground was between the current laws they had and civilian disarmament. You'll notice how this is a shifting middle ground. Well, we're going to move forward to the 80s. At that point, people have been pointing out there are a number of massive abuses with this law, and unsuspecting firearm owners were getting prosecuted. The ATF was making it impossible for FFLs to stay in business. And these abuses needed to be curtailed. So we had the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986, which the gun controllers were absolutely livid about in an attempt to try to kill this bill. Well, you had a senator from New Jersey introduce the Hughes Amendment, which at that point banned future sale of machine guns, even though machine guns are, and by the way, I'm using the legal definition of machine guns. I'm not talking about the class of machine guns, but basically, it would be more accurately put, select fire ban. You see, the NFA called anything select fire a machine gun, be it burst or automatic. It didn't matter which platform it was on. So yeah, instead of actually letting that bill fly and just leaving it alone and saying, hey, you know what, these guys have concerns about decent, law abiding citizens being prosecuted and abused by the government, they wanted to kill that for some reason. And I bring that up specifically because I want to show you that the gun controllers, when they say they want middle ground, aren't looking for middle ground. They'll use this as a false claim. Well, so after this point, we're going to move forward to the 90s. Well, in the 1990s, you had the Brady Bill come through, which that's where you had a temporary waiting period in the country. This is where you had uh, the background check system get put in place. And this was done specifically as a proviso for those in the business of selling firearms. Um, Now, for those who were selling a firearm to a friend or a family member, or just somebody in general, they're just selling a firearm that they had no use for anymore, or wanted, or somebody else wanted it bad enough to pay enough money for it. That was supposed to be okay. So with that, one could say that just putting the commerce background check, excuse me, putting the background check requirement on those engaged in the commerce of manufacturing and selling firearms um, was one thing, and then we were going to leave the private sellers alone. One could have said that that was the middle ground, even though, again, you'll notice the gun control side is not really giving up anything. It's just they're not going as far as they wanted to. Lo and behold, that wasn't good enough, and now they're saying, well, this is insane that we allow private sales of firearms, which a number of us who who were opposing the Brady bill were saying specifically that they weren't going far enough, that they weren't going to stop there. Imagine that, you had, the Brady bill, which would have been another middle ground. And yet, after they got that, that wasn't good enough, because shortly after that passed, you heard of the gun show loophole. Hmm. And that we had to find middle ground and close the gun show loophole yet again. Furthermore, right after the Brady bill passed, you had the 94 ban. People call it the assault weapons ban. Um, Again, that was only supposed to last for 10 years. And then, if it was effective, Congress had the option of voting on it again, which that thankfully failed in Congress then. And thankfully, it had that sunset on it, because let's face it, the Congress and the Bush administration were not going to really push for that being lifted. And, there's a good chance that had that bill come across Bush's desk to get it lifted, Bush might have very well vetoed it. So thankfully it sunsetted. And even the study commissioned under the Clinton administration by the, the DOJ, determined the ban was ineffective too. So, oh, and by the way, while the ban was in place, it wasn't too long after the ban was put in place to where you started hearing the gun control side making the claim that, well, gun manufacturers were getting around the ban by cosmetic modifications to the gun, which ironically is what the gun rights side, the right to keep and bear arms side of this, was saying the assault weapons ban was about, too. Just basically how the gun looks. But that was propaganda when the gun rights side was saying it. This was NRA propaganda when the right to keep and bear arms side of the aisle was saying the assault weapons ban was just about that. You see, so there you have it. There's that double standard there. The gun control side, when they say the guns could have been modified uh, cosmetically to comply with the law, that was somehow just taken at face value. And yes, a number of corporate media outlets just spouted that off as if it was the truth. Which, by the way, yes, gun manufacturers changed the designs on their guns to comply with the law. You know, what a shock. And the second they did that, gun control side said, well, they're skirting the law. They're framing people's compliance with the law as skirting it. Furthermore, in the 90s, you had the Gun Free School Zone Act. You know, yeah, you know, again, finding middle ground. So now, after all this, you have the gun control side saying, oh, well, we need to find middle ground, or at least some of them anyway. You haven't gotten the middle ground already? And the fact of the matter is, folks, is that that middle ground is always going to is never going to be achieved according to the gun controllers. They're never going to achieve that. Look at even Australia. Just recently, they were talking about having another gun control bill because, you know, there was a number of inadequacies in their gun laws too. And this is a country that the gun controllers in the U.S. point to as a shining example of what the U.S. should do, and that we should follow their lead. And they got it right. So the fact of the matter is that we can now see that anybody who is saying, well, we need to find middle ground in this discussion is either ill informed and honestly shouldn't be that ill informed, or they are on the gun control side. Now, with this being said, I know I said I was going to have some firearms as props in the video, but you know, as the video came along, I changed my mind. But this is food for everyone to think about. So, y'all have the comments section below. Y'all take her easy out there and have a great day.